Welcome back, America. We have with us Representative Elise Stefanik, who's really become a superstar as far as I'm concerned, House Republican Conference Chair on the Armed Services Committee from New York. Elise Stefanik, the House Republicans in the Education Committee held a very important hearing. I noticed they haven't done it in the Senate yet under Schumer. And that is to get to the bottom of what the hell's going on these campuses and universities with this virulent anti-Semitism and Jew hatred that reminds one of almost Kristallnacht, where people are marching around talking about exterminating Jews. People are hiding in their dorms rooms and in their libraries. People are afraid, Jews, from going to class to their dorm rooms and so forth and so on. So you bring in the president of Harvard, the president of the University of Pennsylvania, the president of MIT, and what happened? They
failed on the global stage, Mark. What will go down in congressional history as the most viewed congressional testimony in the history of the United States Congress. 3 university presidents could not answer correctly the question, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate their university's code of conduct when it comes to bullying and harassment? I asked the question in such a way that it would and should have been an easy yes, but not a single university president answered it correctly. Instead, their answers dehumanized the Jewish people. The answers reeked of anti-Semitism. The answers even went so far as to say, well, it has to move to conduct or action. And I followed up with, you mean the act of committing genocide? So the world saw over 1 billion views of that heinous testimony. And the only option, Mark, is not only for those 3 university presidents to be fired because they don't deserve the dignity of resignation, but we need to have, and we launched a thorough congressional investigation of not only those universities, but others as well that have allowed anti-Semitism to run rampant on these college campuses.
And we have example after example of threats of violence, of people being scared and so forth and so on. You know, Elise Stefanik, you're not Jewish. You're what I call a righteous Gentile. And in this context, I ask you this question. If it wasn't Jewish students, if it was some other minority group, do you believe the president of Harvard, who you questioned and who was outrageous, do you believe she would have sat there and said, we need acts, it depends on the context, this, that, and the other? Do you believe that's how Harvard and the University of Pennsylvania and MIT would conduct themselves under different circumstances?
There is no question, Mark, that had any other group, any other minority group be put in that question, they would have answered it very differently without any hesitation. They would have said, yes, of course it violates the code of conduct when it comes to bullying and harassment. And that itself is telling. Again, it's the double standard. It's the dehumanization of the Jewish people. And you're right, I'm not Jewish, but I have grown up with many Jewish friends. I went to Harvard Hillel as early as my freshman year. It shocked me that the president of Harvard had not been to Harvard Hillel until after the Hamas terrorist attacks against Israel. And she was dean of the undergrads at Harvard for years and had been at Harvard for decades. So this anti-Semitism is inexcusable, but it needs to be rooted out at its core in these ivory towers. It has poisoned the ivory towers and higher education broadly. And the amount that we have heard from Jewish students who are rightfully fearful for their safety and security, who feel that they cannot pursue their academic pursuits, who cannot go home safely to their dorms because of harassment and threats of assault from university officials, i.e. proctors at Harvard, it is inexcusable, and there needs to be accountability, and there will be.
I'll tell you something else that needs to be held accountable, and that's the Biden administration. I see no urgency. I see no all-hands-on-deck government action. I see very little out of the Department of Justice and the Civil Rights Division there. I see very little out of the Department of Education and the Civil Rights Division there. I see very little out of the Department of Homeland Security. I see no concern about these student visas, where these students are coming from, if people are overstaying their visas. I see no concern about the Hamas network pouring money into these colleges. I see no concern about any of this. I don't even hear statements from the Attorney General of the United States or the head of the Civil Rights Division or clear, concise statements by the President or the Vice President of the United States without bringing in some other group. Am I missing something?
No, you're not missing anything, Mark. There is a fundamental vacuum of leadership on the left, and of course, Joe Biden himself should speak out and condemn and demand for the firing of these 3 university presidents. But the White House should also go a step further and support investigations, and ultimately, there needs to be prosecution against again, this illegal targeting of Jewish students that is happening on these college campuses who are funded with federal funds. Federal funds are pouring into these universities, which we're going to defund higher ed institutions if they allow anti-Semitism to promulgate. But this congressional investigation, which was announced by the Republican chairwoman this past week at my urging, we're not going to hesitate to subpoena communications, documents, all aspects of how these schools and others have mismanaged this crisis that has been growing for years.